Commander Elias Ward blinked against the harsh golden light that spilled from the vaulted ceiling above him. The sound of armored boots echoing off the obsidian-tiled floor as he was dragged through a vast hall unlike anything he'd seen before. The walls shimmered with shifting patterns of alien constellations, while tall banners bearing a serpent coiled around a star hung between towering pillars that stretched impossibly high. And, though his body ached from the crash, the last thing he remembered was his ship, Resolute Dawn, shuddering under Dominion fire. Before falling into atmosphere, his mind stayed sharp, assessing, counting, waiting. He was flanked by 4 alien guards, tall, silver-skinned beings with ridged jaws and impassive expressions, their black armor humming faintly as if alive. And at the far end of the hall stood a raised platform with a throne shaped from a single curve of translucent crystal, glowing faintly with inner light. And on it sat a figure draped in deep blue robes, trimmed in silver threads that caught every flicker of light, like starlight itself, a woman, or something close to it, with eyes like polished violet stones and a crown of delicate metal arching around her head like the wings of a bird frozen mid-flight. Elias was shoved to his knees, not by force but by protocol, though he resisted, straightening his spine despite the pressure of one guard's clawed hand on his shoulder. And then the woman on the throne stood, her voice rising above the silence, like a chord of music, both beautiful and sharp, saying, "You entered the court of Valera, heiress of the Dominion, warden of the Ninth Flame, and rightful ruler of the sovereign stars. Human, you will show respect. Salute your better." And in that moment, the room held its breath, dozens of alien nobles and courtiers watching from the shadows between the pillars, waiting for the human's response. Elias, blood on his brow, uniform torn, met her gaze. Without flinching, his eyes tired but defiant. And slowly, deliberately, he raised his right hand and delivered a sharp, clean Terran military salute, the same one given to admirals, presidents, and fallen comrades. And the moment his hand touched his brow, a ripple passed through the hall like a low murmur in a jungle before a storm. Gasps from those unused to such gestures, weapons twitching in the hands of uneasy guards. But Valera only tilted her head slightly, watching him with unreadable curiosity. Elias lowered his hand, breathing carefully, unsure if he'd just signed his death warrant or started something else entirely. And after a tense pause, the princess laughed out cruelly. But as one might, upon hearing an unexpected melody played in a forbidden key, stepped down from her throne. Each footfall deliberate, the long folds of her robe sliding over the floor like flowing water. And when she stood before him, she said softly, "You refused to kneel, but offered a gesture of your people's respect. 'Tinteresting." And she turned to her advisors with a commanding flick of her hand. "This one shall not be imprisoned with the others. I will speak with him further." To cause a stir among the robed figures gathered at the base of the dais, several beginning to protest in their hissing native tongue, but she silenced them with a single glance, then looked back to Elias and added in perfect English, "You have 3 choices, Commander: obey, challenge, or persuade me." And with that, she turned and walked back to her throne, leaving Elias to wonder why. Out of all the options available to her, the princess had chosen to talk. 2 guards pulled him to his feet and led him down a side corridor, not to a cell, but to a chamber of polished white stone, filled with strange books, maps of unknown star systems, and a faint scent like scorched metal and flowers. And there, he was left alone, the door sealing behind him with a soft hum. And as he stood in that quiet room, blood drying on his face, boots heavy with dust from a dead moon, he realized something strange. He was not a prisoner of war. He was a guestor, maybe a piece in a much larger game he didn't yet understand. Outside, he could hear distant voices, the flutter of wings, mechanical or otherwise, somewhere deep below. The slow thrum of something vast and ancient, empowering the palace. But all he could think about was that moment on the throne floor, that single sentence she had spoken, not with pride or anger, but with interest. Obey, challenge, or persuade. And though Elias had no weapon, no command, and no way home, he knew one thing for sure: the princess hadn't seen the last of the human spirit. And he would not go quietly into whatever test she had planned next. Elias Ward sat alone in the white stone chamber, his thoughts racing as he listened to the low hum of the alien palace. It had been hours since the strange audience with Princess Valera, and still he had no clear answers, no chains, no prison, no interrogation, just silence, and a feeling deep in his gut that something larger was moving around him. The room was filled with alien books and tools, some ancient, others advanced beyond his understanding. Elias didn't touch them. He was too focused on why the princess had chosen to spare him, to what her true purpose might be. The door slid open with a hiss, and 2 guards stepped in, silent as shadows, their dark armor gleaming in the soft light, motioning for him to follow without a word. He stood slowly, alert but calm, and followed them through winding halls, where every surface seemed to shift in color and shape as if alive. At last, they entered a tall chamber lined with balconies and filled with rows of silent watchers, nobles, officers, diplomats, each one staring down with cold alien eyes as Elias was led to a raised platform in the center of the floor. Above him, on a higher throne than before, sat Valera once again, dressed in ceremonial robes of dark silver that shimmered like moonlight on water, her expression unreadable. The crowd whispered in strange tongues, the sound rising like wind through dead trees, until the princess raised her hand and silence fell. She looked down at Elias and said, "Today, you were presented not as a prisoner, but as a lesson." Her voice clear and strong, echoing across the hall, and Elias knew at once he was being tested again. The guards stepped back, leaving him alone before hundreds of judging eyes, and Valera stood, slowly descending the steps toward him with quiet grace, her gaze never leaving his face. She stopped a few feet away and said, "The Dominion does not fear strength, but we do question Defiant's commander. Show them your salute once more, if you dare." And Elias understood that this was no request, and was a challenge, and the hall waited for him to break, to flinch, to fail. He stood tall, his muscles tight with tension, and raised his right hand, just as he had in the throne room before. Fingers straight, palm flat, arm sharp in earth salute, given in the heart of an empire that ruled thousands of worlds, and, as he held it, the hall exploded with gasps and angry hisses, nobles rising from their seats, guards shifting uneasily. But the princess did not stop him. She simply watched, and after a long moment, she turned slowly to face the crowd and said, "He does not kneel. He salutes. He shows respect on his own terms, not ours. This is the spirit of his kind." And her words, though calm, sent another wave of murmurs through the audience. One of her advisors, an elder alien with gold patterns on his skin, stepped forward and growled something in their native tongue. Clearly furious, but Valera raised a single hand and silenced him. "You fear the Terran because he will not break," she said, louder now, "but fear is a poor guide for rulers." And then she looked back at Elias, and, to his surprise, gave a small bow of her head, not in submission, but in recognition. Elias lowered his arms slowly, still tense, still unsure of what this meant, but before he could speak, the doors at the end of the hall slammed open and a new group of guards entered, surrounding a second figure, another human, beaten and shackled, dragged across the floor, and thrown down beside Elias. It was Lieutenant Harrow, his second in command, whom Elias had believed lost during the crash, and Valera looked between them and said, "Now your test is complete. What will you do with your own, knowing I could end him with a word?" Elias stepped forward without thinking, placing himself between Harrow and the princess, his voice steady as he said, "You want to know what makes us human? We don't leave our people behind, ever." And for a long second, no one moved. Then, the princess raised a hand, and the guards pulled back, leaving both men standing alone. She gave a quiet nod and said, "Very well. Let them see what loyalty looks like," and turned away, ascending the stairs once more as Elias helped Harold to his feet. The crowd, watching in silence, now not in anger, but in unease. Something had changed. Some invisible thread pulled loose in the fabric of the palace, and as they were escorted out again, not to cells, but to another chamber, guarded by fewer soldiers, Elias looked over at Harold, who managed a weak grin and whispered, "What did you do, sir?" And Elias replied, "I saluted the wrong princess." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure anymore if it had been wrong at all. Back in the throne room, Valera stood at the window overlooking the glowing city below, her advisors whispering angrily behind her, but she ignored them because in the human's gesture, she had seen something her world had forgotten, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if her throne still felt steady beneath her feet. Elias sat on the edge of the strange bed in the chamber they were given, watching the patterns shift across the walls like flowing water made of light, while Lieutenant Harrow slept restlessly nearby, his injuries still fresh and his breathing uneven. Though the room appeared comfortable, Elias trusted nothing. He had been a soldier long enough to know that gold walls often hid steel traps, and every luxury offered by the enemy came with a hidden cost. The princess had spared them again, but her reasons were unclear. And Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, studied, maybe even tested like animals in a cage made of silk. So he stood quietly and moved around the room, eyes scanning the corners and walls until he found what he had suspected. Thin lines near the ceiling that didn't match the design, too clean, too sharp, and as he leaned in, he spotted a small glint, a tiny lens blinking and near invisible. Pulses. He gave no sign he'd seen it, turned back, and sat down again, forcing calm into his body while his mind worked fast. Someone was listening, and it might not be just the princess. Later, after Harold stirred awake and sipped the thick blue liquid the aliens called medicine, Elias made sure to speak carefully, choosing words that sounded harmless but gave subtle signals. Harold caught on fast, nodding slowly, responding in code they'd used in hostile territory before. They were under surveillance, but not only by the palace. Someone else was watching too. Someone who had tried to silence them already, because that night, as they rested, Elias heard the faintest scrape near the door, and only years of instinct saved him as he rolled off the bed just before a silent needle dart hit the wall behind where his head had been. He dove across the floor, grabbing a chair and smashing it against the wall to trigger an alert, and within seconds, 2 guards rushed in, weapons drawn. But the attacker had vanished, leaving only the broken dart as evidence. Elias picked it up and held it out without a word, his expression cold as the guards exchanged worried glances. Someone had tried to kill him under the princess's own roof. Not long after, Valera summoned him alone to a small garden chamber filled with glowing trees and wind that carried a strange melody. She stood waiting, arms behind her back, her eyes sharper now, not amused, not playful. And when he stepped in, she asked without turning, "Why would someone try to kill you while under my protection?" And Elias replied, "Maybe they don't like what you're learning," which made her glance back at him with a spark of something unreadable. She questioned him then, not like an enemy, but like a curious scholar about Earth, about why humans defy orders, why they fight so hard even when they have nothing left. And Elias answered simply, "Okay, telling stories of lost worlds, hard decisions, victories that cost more than they gave, and lives held together only by the will not to surrender." She listened, silent, then said, "You confuse them. My people are built on order, obedience. But you make them question. And Elias asked, and what about you? But she gave no answer. Days passed, and Elias noticed the guards around them had changed quieter, less aggressive, and one of them, a younger alien with soft silver skin and no armor markings, began slipping small items into their room. A simple food ration, a data pad with old maps, and once a scrap of parchment with alien script that translated to "not all serve willingly." Elias showed the note to Harrow, who now recovered faster and moved with him during short, supervised walks through the palace. Both men observing the layout, the guard changes, the hidden passages, bells, and the places where gold tiles turned dull with age signs of deeper secrets below the surface. They started to build a mental map, not to escape, but to understand the structure of power here, because something was changing. The nobles grew colder each time Elias was seen near the princess, and one night he overheard two officers arguing in a narrow hall, one shouting in harsh alien syllables, while the other warned of contamination of thought and the danger of the Terran's presence. Clearly, his influence was shaking more than just Valera's curiosity, was stirring fear in the heart of a rigid system, and someone wanted him gone before that fear turned to rebellion. Later that night, Valera came to Elias in a private room where soft lights glowed like stars above. Q handed him a metal cube, saying, "This holds records the public never sees, our darker history, sealed away by decree." I read them, and her voice held both sorrow and fire. "We are not as pure as we pretend," and Elias took the cube, holding her gaze, understanding now that she was beginning to question not just her court, but the very foundation of her empire. But knowledge came at a price, and as they parted, neither spoke of the shadows moving faster now, the nobles gathering in secret, the poison being stirred again. Elias returned to their room, heart heavy with the weight of coming choices, and whispered to Harrow, "It's not just about us anymore. We've become the crack in the wall," and outside their chamber, unseen, someone listened and began to plan how to seal that crack before the wall crumbled. The palace of the Dominion gleamed under the pale light of twin moons, its towers standing tall like ancient sentinels, but beneath its golden surface, cracks had started to form, hidden to most but not to Elias Ward. Inside the chamber he shared with Lieutenant Harrow, Elias stood at the window, watching the patrols below change positions more frequently than before. More guards in the halls, more cautious eyes. Something was wrong, something close, and he felt it in the way the air seemed heavier, the way the silence felt too perfect. Harrow, now walking fully again, moved to his side and said in a low voice, "They're preparing for something," and Elias nodded, his thoughts on the metal cube Valera had given him days ago, its secrets still unread, its encryption unfamiliar even to Harrow's skilled hands. And yet he knew that whatever it contained was important enough for the princess to risk her reputation and possibly her throne. A soft tone sounded at the door, and when it opened, it wasn't guards or nobles, but Valera herself, cloaked and without her crown, her expression calm but tense, and she stepped inside quickly, closing the door behind her with a gesture that muted the walls. "There is no time," she said, walking toward Elias and placing something small and silver in his palm. "This is the key to the archive vault below the palace. It will let you read the cube. But once you enter, the system will alert the high chamber, and they will know." And Elias asked, "Why give this to me now?" And Valera's voice broke slightly, just for a second, as she replied, "Because I have lied for too long, and tomorrow they will announce your transfer, a polite word for execution. I cannot protect you anymore." And with that, she turned to leave, pausing only to add, "If you still believe in your salute, Commander, then prove it means more than defiance." And then she vanished into the corridor before he could say another word. They moved quickly after that, slipping out during a shift change. Using side corridors they had memorized, Harrow covering the rear while Elias led them deeper into the palace. Past glittering halls and silent statues, down to where the gold gave way to black stone, and the air grew colder. At last, they reached a locked gate with no guards. Only a strange circular panel glowing faintly, and when Elias pressed the silver key into it, the wall slid aside like a whisper, revealing a long, narrow passage that led to a room filled with quiet machines and dark terminals. The cube clicked into place at the center of a large console, and for a moment, the lights flickered. Then text began to scroll across the screen. Pages of history, hidden orders, sealed missions, names of species wiped from existence, rebellions, crushed not for peace but for power, and at the center of it all, a series of royal decrees signed by Valera's ancestors sanctioning acts of mass control and secret purges. Elias read in silence, his fists clenched, Harrow standing behind him with wide, horrified eyes. And then came the final file, a plan called Succession Silence, dated only days ago, detailing the removal of the princess if her ideological deviation continued, and the scheduled removal of both human prisoners under the cover of diplomatic release. It was all there, the betrayal hidden behind polite words, the schemes layered beneath public smiles. Elias knew then that the mask had broken, not just the one the Dominion wore, but the one Valera wore too, because in giving him this key, she had chosen truth over loyalty. A siren began to wail, soft at first, but growing louder, and red light spilled into the room as voices shouted in the distance someone had noticed. The system had triggered, and the walls were closing fast. Elias grabbed the cube and pulled the key free, Harrow already at the door, and they ran, retracing their steps as alarms echoed through the stone halls. Alien guards rushing past, unaware, their footsteps masked by misdirection and hidden routes. When they finally reached the upper levels again, the palace had changed, no longer quiet and still, but buzzing with confusion. Orders shouted, nobles running in silk robes, drones humming overhead. And in the middle of it all stood Valera on the grand steps of the central chamber, facing a circle of angry advisors, her voice raised but calm as she said, "I will not allow this deception to continue." And they turned on her like wolves, demanding answers, accusing her of treason. And then one figure stepped forward, Admiral Orcs, a cold-eyed military leader who had always stood too close to the throne, and he lifted a data crystal in the air, shouting, "She has allied with the Terrans. She gave them access to forbidden archives." And the crowd gasped as Valera stood frozen, her shoulders tense. Before she could speak, Elias stepped into the hall beside her, cube in hand, holding it high, and said in a loud, steady voice, "She didn't betray you, she saved you from betraying yourselves." And every eye turned to him, a lone human, standing beside a royal in open defiance of tradition. Orcs snarled and raised his hand to signal the guards, but before the order could be given, a different voice rang out from the far wall, one of the nobles who had remained silent until now, stepping forward and saying, "Let him speak." And the chamber paused. Elias placed the cube on a central pedestal and activated it, projecting the forbidden truths into the air, spinning slowly in lines of alien language and visual recordings, war crimes, secret trials, extermination, orders, and the hall erupted in chaos, some shouting denials, others falling silent with shame. And amidst the noise, Valera turned to Elias, her voice low and shaking, "They will never forgive me." But Elias replied, "Then stop trying to be forgiven and start leading." And with that, the princess stepped forward, raised her voice above the rest, and declared, "This ends today. No more silence, no more shadows." And even though the room did not cheer, even though many still watched with hatred. Something shifted because the mask had broken, and the truth, once revealed, could never be hidden again. The throne room that once stood as the heart of the Dominion now echoed with silence and fear. Its golden walls dimmed, its banners lowered, and its guards absent from their posts, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Valera stood at the center, her crown gone, her royal sash torn at the edge. Yet her voice was steady as she faced the High Council that had turned from advisors to accusers in only a single day. Tia and Elias watched her from the corner, hidden in the shadow of a fallen pillar, while Harrow kept watch at the side entrance where loyal guards had once stood, but now waited under orders from Admiral Orcs. Everything had fallen apart faster than anyone had expected after the forbidden truths from the archive were shown. The entire court had split down the middle, with half of the nobles denying everything, calling the records false, a human trick to divide them, and the other half whispering behind closed doors, too afraid to speak out loud, but unwilling to go back to pretending. The Dominion had ruled for centuries with strict order and silence. And now the silence was broken. The order was crumbling. Kay and Valera, the last princess of a royal line that had written the darkest laws, had chosen not to hide, but to fight for what she now believed was right, even if it meant losing everything. To lose it, she did, because that morning the seal of the royal family had been stripped from the palace gates, and the council had declared her authority suspended for mental instability under alien influence, the words spoken calmly by a noble who couldn't even meet her eyes. Elias had wanted to speak then, to defend her, but Valera had stopped him with a quiet look, full of fire and sorrow. And he had understood this was not his battle to fight with words, it was hers. Now she stood with no empire behind her, no soldiers to protect her, and yet she looked more like a leader than ever before. Her shoulders straight, her eyes full of purpose. Outside the palace, unrest was spreading. More and more citizens had heard rumors of the archive cube. And though the council denied its truth, people whispered in marketplaces and transport stations, asking questions, doubting the noble voices that once ruled without question. Orcs had tightened security, put curfews in place, and ordered the arrest of anyone found spreading anti-Dominion lies. But it was too late. The truth had taken root, and it was growing fast. Elias and Harrow moved quietly through the city each night, meeting with engineers, students, and even a few former soldiers who believed in change, sharing parts of the archive in secret, always careful, always watching for spies. But it was clear the tide was turning. And then came the order. Valera was to be exiled at dawn, sent to a distant moon colony for reflection and healing. But everyone knew what that meant. Quiet death, far from the eyes of the people, and without trial. Elias knew they had to act, and quickly. So that night, as the moons rose over the city once more, he and Harrow slipped into the private landing bays beneath the palace with a stolen clearance chip and a half-repaired scout vessel that Harrow had secretly reactivated. Over the past week, they waited in the shadows as Valera was brought down the long corridor by two guards in black armor, their steps loud against the metal floor. And just before they reached the ship, a power surge shut the lights off for exactly 3 seconds. Enough time for Harrow to strike fast and silent, and for Elias to pull Valera into the vessel and start the engines. Alarms screamed behind them as the hangar gates tried to close, but the ship burst through just in time, scraping metal and sparking fire as it broke free into the upper atmosphere and vanished into the clouds. Sighed, Valera sat in silence, at first staring at the stars beyond the window, her eyes full of pain but no regret. And Elias didn't speak. He simply sat beside her, letting the moment pass. Finally, she turned and said, "There is no throne anymore." And Elias replied, "Good. Then build something better." And those words stayed with her as they crossed into the shadow side of the planet. Hiding their signal and planning their next move. They couldn't go back, not yet, but they didn't need to, because by the time the sun rose, the first waves of protest had begun, not with weapons, but with voices, people gathering in squares, repeating the words they had read from the archive, holding up old flags turned upside down and shouting for change. The council responded with fear, sending drones and troops to break up gatherings, but for every person arrested, 3 more rose in their place. The Dominion was no longer united in silence, it was now divided by truth. Aboard the ship, Elias watched the reports come in from hidden channels, and he knew the time was coming when they would have to return, not as fugitives, but as leaders of something new. Valera, the princess of no empire, now had more power than she ever did on the throne. By command, but by choice, by sacrifice. By the simple courage of facing what her ancestors had hidden. And though there were only 3 aboard a small, stolen vessel, they carried the spark of something that could burn down the false gold walls of 1,000 years. Shaman light the path to something far more real, high above the burning towers of the Dominion's capital. A ship no larger than a transport drone hovered behind a patch of old satellites. Hidden from patrol scans and shielded by jamming signals Harrow had stitched together, using scavenged tech from a dozen different systems. And inside, Elias stood at the edge of the observation deck, his eyes locked on the site of his old prison, now turned into the heart of a revolution. Fires burned along the city's outer wall, not from destruction, but from barricades lit by citizens who refused to return to silence. And as Elias watched, he felt the weight of everything they had risked to reach this moment, pressing down on his shoulders, not just the danger, but the question, would it be enough? Behind him, Valera adjusted the old Dominion communicator she now wore across her chest, like a war badge. Its signal tuned to an encrypted channel her allies had smuggled into the council's control tower the night before. And Harrow crouched beside her, tapping fast through layers of defense protocols, as if unlocking the final vault of a long-dead empire. And then came the moment they had waited for. A green light on the panel blinked twice, confirming that the citywide broadcast system was now under their control for exactly 5 minutes. No more, and Valera rose, her face calm but hard. The face of a leader with no title, but more power than a throne could ever give. And Elias nodded once, stepping back as she began to speak. Across the city, every screen lit up with her image, not dressed in gold or cloaks, but in simple gray clothes, the outfit of an exiled citizen, and her voice, strong and clear, echoed across every district, every sky bridge, every home. This is Valera, daughter of a broken line, and I speak not as a ruler, but as one of you, she said. And her words cut through the noise of fear and confusion, as people stopped running, stopped hiding, and began to listen. She spoke of the truths buried beneath centuries of silence, of the false peace bought with the suffering of others, of the lies told to keep the Dominion pure, and of the courage of those who had dared to uncover it. And as her voice rang out, crowds began to gather once more, not out of anger, but with hope in their eyes. In the square below the old council hall, a group of young workers climbed onto the statue of the first King press and draped it with a cloth painted in the symbol of the new Movement 3 broken rings, 1 symbols of unity, now torn open too. Let light pass through, and the others followed, raising their hands, not in obedience, but in choice. Then, just as quickly, the signal was cut, and the screens went black again, but the spark had been lit. And, even as the patrols rushed out to tear down the banners and scatter the people, something had changed that could not be undone. Elias turned to Valera, saw the exhaustion in her eyes, and said, "It started." And she nodded, replying, "Now we must make sure it doesn't stop." The next few hours were chaos. The council declared martial law, and Admiral Orcs ordered the deployment of the Dominion fleet over the capital, ready to strike if rebellion spread further. But the people did not hide instead. More and more of them filled the streets, unarmed, voices rising in unison, not with violence but with words, with truth. And in that sea of resistance, soldiers began to hesitate, to question, and even to turn. Then came the final movie, Laius and Harrow. Using old access codes, Valera still remembered from her time as royal heir, slipped into the core broadcast facility buried beneath the palace itself, past broken scanners and silent guards who let them pass without a word, and there, beneath layers of stone and steel, they activated the oldest system in the Dominion, the ceremony platform, once used to declare new rulers before the entire star network, a system untouched in over 100 years. They didn't use it to crown anyone. Instead, Elias stepped forward, placed the cube of forbidden knowledge into the central console, and let the truth speak for itself, sending every record, every image, every hidden file to every ship, every colony, every satellite that still answered to the Dominion's name. And across the stars, from mining outposts to academy worlds, the silence cracked. And the people who had been ruled without ever knowing why finally saw behind the mask. The Dominion's rule didn't fall in fire or war, it fell in understanding, in the simple but powerful choice of people who decided they would no longer obey lies. When Elias and Valera emerged from the depths of the palace, the city square was filled with thousands, and at the center, a circle of former guards stood, weapons lowered, surrounding Admiral Corex, now stripped of his command, his orders, refused, his fleet silent above, and he stared at Elias, not with anger, but disbelief, because he had never thought the people would choose a human over their own blood. Elias stepped forward, not as a conqueror, but as a symbol of what had changed, and Valera beside him, not as royalty, but as the one who gave up her crown to lead with truth. The crowd parted, and a young child stepped forward, raising a hand in the old Dominion salute, but with an open palm instead of a closed fist. And soon, others followed, the symbol spreading through the crowd like a wave, not of control, but of choice. Elias stood tall, looked at Valera, then at the crowd, and returned the salute not as a soldier, not as a prisoner, but as a free man. And the people cheered, not for a victory of war, but for a future they would build together, one where no voice would be silenced again, and where the salute of the free would mean something new, something lasting, for every world that once bowed to gold.